Good morning, everyone. We will start shortly. Surya, do you recommend that we start or we wait?
Yeah, you can just start it.
All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. Well, good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Before anything, I would like to inform the attendees that we have an interpretation service for this webinar. In the bottom part of your screen, you should see an interpretation button that you can press and choose interpretation for English or Bahasa as needed. If you have any technical questions regarding this, feel free to write that on the chat. Now, I would like to officially welcome you to our first webinar of the webinar series on the impacts of corporate reporting standards, with a focus on Indonesia, and then the upcoming second part of the 15th conference of the parties of the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD COP15. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Paula Pinto, and I'll be responsible for hosting this webinar today. I work at Climate & Company as an international policy analyst and have been supporting the G7, G20 Track to Dialogue project, under which this webinar series is developed. This project is developed by German Watch, a non-governmental organization that lobbies for sustainable global development. This project aims at assisting the dialogue among civil society actors, aiming to building a bridge between them and political decision makers in order to strengthen cooperation between the heads of states and governments within the G20. Therefore, we focus on Indonesia as it has held the G20 presidency in 2022, but also as one of the key suppliers to the EU. For more information on the project, please check the link that we will post in the chat soon. We would like as well to thank our partners in Indonesia from the Climate Change Center of Institute Technology Bandung, the CCTITB, is the central and foremost research center in climate change in Indonesia. The director of the center is Professor Djoko Santoso Abisuroso. Since 2011, the center has served several climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions through scientific technology and policy approaches in order to develop an integrated governance and finance in climate change. CCCITB has extensive experiences with various international organizations and has been providing advices to multiple national, regional, and local governmental agencies in Indonesia. Thanks to all the team that has been of great support for the organization of these events. Before jumping into the topic, I would like to quickly present the agenda for today. We will have the welcome words by Dr. Elizabeth Hawke. Then we will have Luis Simon from Climate & Company as well, speaking about the EU supply chain regulation and deforestation law. Next, we will have Paktimer Manurung on land use and forestry components for achieving sustainability in Indonesia. We will then have Sonia Dia on green trade, increasing Indonesia's palm oil sustainability. And last but not least, we will have Professor Nyoman Pujawan talking about the potential challenges and opportunities for Indonesian exporting businesses that is needed to make its implementation in Indonesia meaningful. We will then have a panel discussion where I will ask a question to all the speakers, and we will then have a Q&A time slot as well. So for the participants, if you have any question, please already submit it as they come to you in the Q&A feature that you should also see below your below your screen. Now, without further, now I would like to welcome Elizabeth Hogg, a Senior External Advisor, Forestry and Sustainable Land Use at Climate & Company, who will introduce us to the topic of this event. Lisa, you have the floor.
I needed to unmute myself, sorry, now I'm back. Welcome everybody, I'm very happy to see you all here today and to be able to participate in this event. I would like to welcome you on behalf of Climate & Company to this very important exchange between Indonesian and European partners. In my experience, there can never ever be enough international, bilateral or interjurisdictional cooperation. It is key for reaching common objective. And as a basis for cooperation, we always need dialogue. We need exchange of views, of information between governments, but also between civil societies, researchers, private sector. It is important to understand each other better. And it continues to be important. It never loses importance. And speaking a bit on the European side, I'd like to introduce what we will present here today. Europe has introduced its Green Deal in 2019. It's a strategic policy framework to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. And part of this package is on the one hand the renewed sustainable finance strategy that shall facilitate sustainable investments of at least €1 trillion between 2022 and 2023. And also part of this package is the reinforcement of the 2019 EU commitments on forests. And part of this reinforcement of this strategy is the European objective to reduce its own footprint, the footprint of EU consumption of land, and encourage the consumption of products from deforestation-free supply chains. And below all these frameworks or strategic policy packages, the EU is currently developing a number of regulations to address these issues. Today we are focusing on two that my colleague Louise Simon will present shortly. One is the proposed regulation for deforestation-free products, and the second is the upcoming Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This is very often also called the EU supply chain law, but it's clearer if we separate in the regulation for deforestation-free products and the due diligence directive, because it's two different regulations that are being developed. And with this dialogue, or this series of dialogue, we want to contribute to closing information gaps, to help policymakers, stakeholders in producing countries in Indonesia, as well as businesses to understand what is coming and to adapt, if wished so, as early as possible, so that trade between Indonesia and the EU can successfully continue in a less destructive and more sustainable way. And when we talk about all these changes, these transformations, these sustainability transformations, it's also key to not forget to look at the small and medium-sized enterprises, but also smallholders, communities, the informal sector. It is them that live and depend on their production sites in forested areas. And this issue needs to receive a lot of attention in the exchange of information. And it needs especially insights from local experts. That's why we are very happy to have so many knowledgeable people today on the panel and in this call. And on the last note, I'd like to mention that we have also a cooperation with Brazil on these topics. And we've just launched last week a document, a rather detailed policy brief, both on European and Brazilian regulations, existing ones, but also the ones in development, in the areas of sustainable finance and sustainable land use. And we are very happy to share this document with you as well today. I think the link will be posted in the chat, and hope that this overview of what is happening in the EU, but if you're interested as well in Brazil, of course, also in Brazil, is hopefully useful for your work. So with this, I hand back over, and very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this great introduction to the topic and for setting the floor for the interesting presentations to come. Now, I'm delighted to introduce you to our first panelist, Louise Simon. Louise is a policy analyst at Kleinman & Company. She holds a master's degree in sustainability science, policy and society, and a bachelor's degree in economics and business economics from Maastricht University. She developed an expertise in EU policy decision-making and governance through her work on the European semester, as well as more recently by coordinating a project on the importance of ambitious and coherent EU policy framework for halting deforestation. Louise, thank you for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen and hopefully it works directly. I hope you can all see this screen.
We see you.
Right, well, thank you very much for having me today and giving me the opportunity to present to the audience these two key legislative proposals which aim to tackle the impact of companies throughout their supply chain on biodiversity and deforestation issues. I'm using the term here legislative proposals and not yet law, because as I will explain a bit more later, the two policies which I will introduce to you are not yet adopted and enforced. So the agenda for this short introduction looks as follows. First, I will give you a bit more information on the context of the two proposals. Second, I will dive in detail into the proposal for a corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which for now I will call the due diligence directive to be a bit shorter. And I will finish by going into the proposal for a regulation on deforestation-free product, which I will call the deforestation regulation. So as Elizabeth introduced, the EU has designed multiple strategies to protect biodiversity and forests, as well as to ensure that agriculture and the food value chains contribute to the objective of climate neutrality and to the different global biodiversity frameworks. The two legislative proposals of today's presentation can be seen as falling under these different commitments amongst others. Their objectives can be seen as mutually supportive, as both aim to ensure that companies conduct human rights and/or environmental due diligence throughout their supply. An important distinction between the due diligence directive and the deforestation regulation is their level of focus. As I'm trying to show with this figure, the due diligence directive is more overarching. We like to see it as this umbrella legislation, which covers international human rights and international environmental norms. This proposal is not limited to specific products or sectors and can thus be considered somehow as having a broader scope. On the other hand, the deforestation regulation can be seen as some kind of branch of the due diligence directive, although it came before the due diligence one. This one is commodity specific, tackling a particular problem, which is deforestation. Also, as I will explain a bit more later, the deforestation regulation aims at regulating markets. So in general terms, we can think of these two proposals as aiming to be complementary. I will now dive into the proposal for a due diligence directive. So the overall objective of this proposal is to ensure that companies comply with their responsibilities to respect human rights and environmental standards by exercising due diligence. But what is due diligence, you might ask? Exercising due diligence is taking the necessary step to avoid committing offense. Here, as you can see on the figure on the right, the OECD prescribes that due diligence should be exercised taking the following steps. Companies need to first introduce due diligence policies into their overall functioning. They need to assess their environmental and human right adverse impact. They need to mitigate the potential impact and put an end or minimize the actual impact. They should monitor the development of their policies and check whether they're effective. And finally, they need to communicate about it to the wider public. I'm happy to answer questions you might have on this cycle more in detail during the Q&A. Moving on to the scope of the due diligence directive. It tackles both EU companies and non-EU companies operating in the EU. So within the EU companies, you have first the companies with high turnover and high number of employees, as well as those companies with lower turnover and lower employee number, but that operate in those high-risk sectors by a minimum of 50% of their turnover. And those high-risk sectors are textiles, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and food production, and the extraction and trade of mineral resources. For non-EU companies operating in the EU, either they can fulfill one of the two criteria. Either they have a high turnover, here of 150 million euros generated in the EU, or they can have lower turnover, but as well must operate at least 50% of their turnover in high-risk sectors, as I explained above. Now, it's also important to understand the scope of the value chain, which is considered here. The obligations for companies apply to adverse impact on the environment and human rights stemming from their own operations, their subsidiaries, and the operations across the value chain carried out by entities with which the company has an established business relationship. The concept here of established business relationship causes a lot of debates because it would mean that only business relationship lasting in time would be covered, which could lead to the risk that companies move to shorter contracts only, which really doesn't give stability to smallholders, etc. Another important thing to mention is that SMEs are not directly included in the scope of the regulations, but that they could be affected as contractors of or subcontractors of those companies that fall under the scope. Now, I wanted to also go a bit through the timeline of the regulation so that we understand a bit better when it will be applicable to whom. So as I said, it's not yet in law, it's not official, it's still being discussed between the different co-legislators in the EU. So right now there are discussions within the Parliament, within the EU Council, and we're expecting to have an adoption of this directive by the end of 2023. And then because this is a directive, it needs to be transposed into national law. So each EU member state will have to take the time and adopt the directive into its own national legislation. And then only from 2026 onwards will the national regulation become applicable. And that will be done first for those higher turnover companies, and then later in time for those other smaller companies. Now moving into the regulation on deforestation-free products, so the deforestation regulation. What is it all about? What is its objective? Well, this deforestation regulation aims to really minimize the consumption coming from the EU of products which are linked to deforestation and forest degradation. It does so by focusing on 6 forest risk commodities, which are cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil palm, soy, and wood. And later on, we're expecting for other commodities such as rubber and maize to also be included in the scope of this regulation. How does it aim to regulate the market? Well, basically, the regulation, the proposal by the Commission says that the products can only be placed on or exported from the EU market if they are deforestation-free. And the regulation gives an exact definition of what it means to be deforestation-free. If they're produced in compliance with legislations in producer countries, and that could be anything from any legal way of producing certain things, any human rights law, etc. And lastly, any due diligence statements need to be submitted by operators and traders to some authorities which are verifying the information that indeed their products are deforestation-free and produced in compliance with national legislations. Moving on to the scope. So the scope here of the regulation is a bit less prescriptive, basically because it says that any operators and traders making available on or exporting from the EU markets the relevant commodities or products using this commodity have to comply with their regulation. In terms of how this affects actors in producer countries, well, if the producer country is also making available the product on the EU market directly, it will get affected by the regulation. But it's also important to consider that all the actors within the value chain will have to provide information to those operators and traders falling under the scope of the regulation on whether they are actually producing their products following deforestation-free compliance, etc. So the smallholders in producer countries will be highly affected, and there are a lot of talks on this at the moment. Then moving to the timeline, this regulation is a bit more advanced than the due diligence directive, because we are expecting to have a compromise of the regulation by the end of this year, and thus an exact entry into force in the coming weeks. During the year 2023, it's a bit the balance where it's not yet applicable, but the Commission will start doing all those impact assessment on what is the impact for smallholders. It is expected to create certain guidelines, commodity guidelines for producers, traders and operators to comply with the regulations, and as well as going to prepare the review for adding potentially new commodities in the regulations. In 2024, though, the regulation will become applicable for operators, and in 2025, it will become applicable for those micro enterprise operators only. So I hope this gave you a bit of an introduction to those two legislative proposals, and that this gives you a bit of an idea of how producer countries might be affected by those, but as well as the importance of having this legislation as ambitious as possible. And as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have at the end during the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Luis, for this amazing presentation. These proposals are extremely complex, and your intervention has been key to break them down for us and highlight how and when this will impact Indonesian exporting businesses. I invite again the attendees to take advantage of Luis's expertise and to post questions for her on the Q&A box. Now, on to our next speaker. I would like to introduce Mr. Timer Manurung, Chairman of Auriga Nusantara. He graduated from Faculty of Forestry of Gajah Mada University, also has a background study in economy and law. Mr. Timer Manurung is a more than 2 decades NGO activist with notable milestones, as he has established the Yayasan Silva Gama in 2000 and later transformed it into Auriga Nusantara Foundation in 2014. He joined Telepac in 2005 until 2008, where he led its program on tackling illegal logging, which one of its impacts were the EU-Indonesia Agreement on Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade. He also joined WWF Indonesia in 2010 until 2013 as advocacy coordinator on Java Rhino conservation and policy work. Timer Manurung, I would like to give the floor to you.
Hello, everyone. As Patimer said that he have a connection problem, and he asked for about 5 minutes for the next time budget. So
all right. Then we can perhaps continue with the next intervention, and then we can go back to Timer Manurung.
Okay.
So then I would like to introduce Sonia Dia. She is a research officer at C4ICRAF Indonesia. Sonia is a member of a research group, Green Value Chain, Integrated Business Model and Innovative Financing at C4ICRAF Indonesia. She holds a Master's of Science in Tropical International Forestry from Göttingen University in Germany and a Bachelor of Science in Forest Management from IPB University, Indonesia. Sonia, thank you so much for joining us, and you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. And let me share my screen. Okay, 1 minute, please. Okay, I hope you all can see my screen, and thank you for inviting me here. And today I'm not alone. I have Professor Harry Purnomo with me. We are from C4ECRAF. It is an international organization that's focusing on forestry and agroforestry research, and we are based in Indonesia. And in this occasion, I would like to share with you several findings from our studies within the topics of green trade, increasing Indonesia's palm oil sustainability. And here are some contents of our presentations today. And we'll start with a brief overview of palm oil trade in Indonesia. And as we know, Indonesia is the largest producers as well as exporters of palm oil global trade. And in 2021, Indonesia acquired more than 50% global trade volume for palm oil. On the other way, Indonesia also the biggest consumers, which is we can see that Indonesia has very high rate of domestic consumptions of palm oil. And in 2021, 60% productions of palm oil from Indonesia are for export. And if we can see here, the top 10 market countries, the top 3 are China, India, and EU. And a little bit overview of Indonesian palm oil trade with EU. We see here the trade volume between EU and Indonesia seems at a stagnant rate by time. And I think we consider EU as a green buyer because usually buyer in EU will require sustainability measures. And latest report from ADH, it stated that majority, around 90% palm oil imports by EU in 2020 are certified as sustainable palm oil. And how about palm oil sector in Indonesia? So we have study under the Trade Development and the Environment Hub research. We try to identify what are the most important trade and political economy indicators for sustainable palm oil in Indonesia. We conducted a systematic review on key trade and political and economy indicators, then assess what are the most important indicators. So here are the results of our systematic reviews. The review suggested these 55 indicators for each factors. And we also conducted the expert survey. So we distribute the questionnaire to more than 100 respondents that considered as key stakeholders of palm oil sector in Indonesia and get more than 100 responses. And based on their responses, we develop a model using a structural equation modeling called POPETS. And this model helped us to see the relation between each factors and also what are the most important factors for the sustainability of palm oil sector in Indonesia. And POPET's model help us to understand that trade factors indeed important for the sustainability of palm oil in Indonesia. And the pathway are trade influencing structure and institutional settings of palm oil sector. Then it lead into the actor actions toward the sustainability. And our model also suggested that the sustainability defined as no deforestation and employment. And another interesting findings from this study are, if we see here in the trade factors, international demand and green consumer behavior is one of the significant indicators that influence sustainability. And I think that's why the Green Trade Initiative is important to improve the sustainability of palm oil in Indonesia. And another study also from Trade Hub is the simulations of the Green Trade Initiative, the Global Green Trade Initiatives for Indonesia. We developed a model using a value chain dynamic approach called EPOS to assess the impact of policy scenarios on the at the national levels. So we measure the environmental, also economic outputs from the policy implementations, and one of them are EU RED 2. So we assume that the biodiesel ban will be implemented. And our simulation shows that the EU biodiesel ban only decreasing the Indonesia's export value by 1% is not really significant, but in our paper that was published in 2022, we mentioned that the biodiesel ban by EU maybe trigger similar actions from other countries, or could possibly extend to bans on other forms of palm oil products. And we can see now on the plate, there's EU deforestation-free regulations. So we advancing that model, the EPOS model into POTLAS model, to assess again the recent green trade initiatives for Indonesia. But at this time, POTLAS model assess the impact at landscape level. And we take Kota Waringin Barat Regency as a case study. And this is to see how we use the model to simulate. And you can see the tree graph in the bottom shows how the simulations, and the different line shows the different scenario. And in this case, we show how we simulate the EU deforestation-free regulations to see the impact at the landscape level in Kota Waringin Barat. In general, the result shows that, of course, the implementations of global green trade initiatives such as EU deforestation-free regulations help to avoid deforestation at landscape level. However, it caused loss in the palm oil economics for Indonesia. And then using that POTLAS model, we try to find the scenario to reconciliate the economic output and environmental output for the global green trade initiatives. And here we see the outputs of the scenario simulations across all scenarios. We can see the reconciliation of environmental and economic benefit at landscape level is still not achieved when the global green trade initiatives implemented alone. We can see here in scenario B and C. And in scenario D and E, we try to combine global green trade initiatives with also implementing national scheme for payment of environmental services, such as carbon policy, carbon tax, and for example, ecological fiscal transfer. But still, we cannot compensate economic loss from the trade value. And however, in scenario F, if we apply premium price together with the green trade initiatives and also the national policy on payment of environmental services, it shows that the reconciliation is possible to happen. However, our study, we need a further study to assess the impact of the global green trade initiatives, because in Indonesia, as we know, even though the major exporter are private company, but at the palm oil traded internationally, some part came from the smallholder farms. And I think smallholders may have different challenges with the private company, how to comply with the green trade policy. So here are some conclusions from my presentations, that sustainability is not a sole responsibility of producers. Our results suggested that it also driven by the consumers' behaviors and demand. And that's why green trade initiatives is very important, and it needs commitment by producers and consumer both. And then our study also show that it is possible to reconcile national and international initiatives for sustainable palm oil trade in Indonesia. And I think I still have a few minutes. I would like to invite Prof. Harry, if you may add something.
Oh, thank you, Konya. Just one thing, that the POTLAS is being reviewed by Ecological Economic Journal. So we submitted to that journal, and POPET is going to Forest Policy and Economic Journal. So all are being reviewed in the high-level journal. So we welcome your suggestion, and I will share the info brief of those findings on the chat box. Thank you, Anya.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Harry. Yeah, that's all from us. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Professor Purnomo, for such insightful presentation and this deep dig into palm oil sustainability. You both have conducted extremely interesting research that I am sure that is already and will continue to be key for the palm oil industry to adapt to the proposed regulations that we are discussing today. Yeah, I wanted to ask if you could share the links to your publications, but I think Professor Purnomo has already addressed that as well. Now I think I've gotten, I can see that Timer Manurungs is now, has now joined us. So I would like to give you the floor. I will just briefly introduce you again. Mr. Timer Manurung is the chairman of Auriga Nusantara, which was founded in 2014. He has also worked joined Telepac in 2005 to 2008, and later on he also joined WWF Indonesia from 2010 to 2013. He graduated from the Faculty of Forestry of Gajah Mada University and also has a background study in economy and law. Mr. Timen Manurung, you have the floor, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Paula, for the introduction, and sorry for coming late. Is my voice here? Okay. Okay.
We hear you.
Yeah. So now okay. I'll share my screen. Okay. I put my screen in Google's. So okay. Oh.
Perfect.
Okay. But how to minimize this? Oh yeah. So yeah, based on the topic that I am asked to present to, I modified it a bit because there is a sustainability point in the title that being asked, but I is as we believe that sustainability basically is more and symptom. And then I will not I'm not going directly to the symptom, but to the root cause of the symptom, which we see industrialization roadmap is the answer. Not only for palm oil, but so many commodities in Indonesia. For example, in now we have we are preparing a report that's showing that actually the biggest deforestation driver at the moment is nickel mining, even surpassing palm oil in the last years. But it's again, we do not have industrialization map of that because we do not have, let's say, a quota for a year, how many we can harvest per year. And it's quite similar for all commodities as well in Indonesia. So I put my presentation is land cover dynamics and then it's for commodities industrialization roadmap. Oh, how to, okay, this one. So we have in collaboration with Brazilian colleagues and also a network of civil society Indonesia, we develop a platform showing land cover dynamics in Indonesia. At the moment, we have 10 land cover class. We have natural forest, mangrove, mining, palm oil, other agriculture, etc. So we have 10 class in this platform, what we call Biomass Indonesia, showing that actually in commodities base, Indonesia increasingly have palm oil is significant. In 2000, we have about 7 million hectares palm oil. In 2019, we have 16 point something. Before, the government only admit that through statistic, plantation statistic, it's about 14. But now nowadays they admit, the government admit is more than 16 million hectares, in between of 16.3 to 16.8. If 16.8, if we cover, we calculate as well replanting area. So this is the it this platform basically show palm oil is increased in Indonesia, but not only palm oil, it's also timber plantation, acacia, eucalyptus that actually in the country dominate or controlled by two family only. It's in 2000 we have 1 million hectares. Nowadays we have about 3 million hectares, so 200% increasing. At the same time, also at the same period of time, we also have a mining that expanding, open pit, whole mining area. It's before 300,000 hectares. Now we have almost 1 million hectares. So 3 times increase mining area. So this is the platform, and again but then the major of deforestation in Indonesia is basically agriculture. So this is the forest life and what the forests going to. Then for other agriculture, non-forest vegetation, oil palm, forest plantation, we have the numbers and we can show that year by year and also the transition from which type of landscape land cover to certain types of landscape, because in the platform is available. If you have time, just go to biomas.nusantara.org. This is the website. And this is the timber plantation. You can see here the number year by year, and then this one is the land cover changing. So this from forest, this etc. So this is the class that changing and directly, and now here we are here. So you can see it's quite beautiful in showing, but it's in the field it's not beautiful actually. And this is year by year increase of the timber plantation. And this one is, if this is for timber plantation, and this one is for palm oil. So you can see the island here. This is Sulawesi. You can see the trend, and then this Kalimantan, this Sumatra. So basically the statistical here. So basically we can say here actually only 19% of our current palm oil stands, palm oil plantation, that come from forests in 2000. So if we use cutoff date of 2000, basically our palm oil just deforesting just 3 million hectares, 19% of that, because and you see the land cover that convert mainly is other agriculture. In Sumatra, mostly rubber. And this is the land, this is the legend. You can see this is the forest, and this one non-forest, and then it's all oil palm that already have in 2000. And come again, I will use the plantation, the timber, the palm oil as a model that the needs for industrialization, what we call industrialization. I will come that later. But you can see here the integration, the domination. Actually, here is plantation. So you can see we have about 17 million hectares, 30,000 something concession, almost 2,000 companies, and then it's only, so this is integration. So only 187 groups. And this one plantation, then go to the mill again. This is also dominate integration. So the mill, we have this capacity per year about 1,000 mills in the country. Companies is 800, but it's control only 178 groups. But then in refinery, you will see then we have this capacity. We have about less than 90 refinery in the country. This 60 companies, but only 25 groups. So then this is the controller of our industry. Basically, it's quite similar than in trading, because this is all domination or integration. This one showing the graphic is about This is the plantation, this mill, and then refinery trading. The top three of this plantation, most of our plantation is here is unknown because so many names, including smallholders, and this is unidentified. And this top three of the groups only control this portion, and then this top five control this portion, and this proportion, and top 10 control this. But then in increase in males. So this top three, but quite significant changing in control and domination is in refinery. So you will see the top 10 of the groups control actually about 80% of the industry. Quite similar basically in the trading. So it's domination. It's not wealth. It's not health in our industry basically. And the name of the groups here. So you can see this plantation mills, etc. You can see the constant of the groups. So it's actually, if you want to look at what is actually the name of the group, just go to the legend here. This is the domination, and that's why we see it is not health, and so we need to reform that. And for Indonesia, basically saying is or embracing or how to say it, congratulating us that our deforestation is decreased, but we actually worry about the case more the indicating worries for us, because if you look at the trend here, it is the non-forest rich provinces that are going decrease, but in forest rich provinces basically increasing. So then why this happened? Because the forest perhaps it did more research on this, is because the forest in particularly western part of the country, that deforestable is going vanish already. The forest remaining basically either national park or well managed concession area. So this is the situation at the moment in Indonesia, and we see this the possible three types of deforestation in future is first in concession area, because we have now about 9 million hectares natural forest cover in concession, which 3.6 billion hectares in mining concession is natural forest, 2.8 million hectares natural forest in timber plantation concession, 2.4 million hectares in oil palm concession. This is the first one, and then the second one is government projects. It's like new capital, Pute State, economic zone, etc. Even smelter that indirectly increase deforestation in mining concession. It's part of this the government projects. And the third type is landlordless area, like at the end at the early of this this year, government revoke permits in Papua, for example, but then since revoke, even increasing deforestation because no effective management of the area there. So then this is the I will go to this first. Why we need this industrialization is because you can see here is the number of the capacity mill. It is the number of production, of the each province. Basically, only in South Sulawesi and Papua that our current mill in palm oil is under capacity. Most of the area is in over capacity of the mill. If we come to the current logic of the government, it's then directly stimulating idea to have more plantation. But as we map year by year our palm oil, we believe that our current palm oil basically can feed this all, because most of the plantation at the moment we have is in the young age, not in the peak production stage. So I think in our calculation is our current plantation actually can feed all the mills. But then if you look at the let's say distribution, it's mostly in Sumatra and Kalimantan, while in Papua and in Sulawesi is not the case. So we need to find a way of how to stabilize, to balancing the production and the mills, because we see that in Sumatra, in Aceh, for example, the nearer the mill, the higher deforestation will be. So less than 10 kilometers from the mill, it is the deforestation by palm oil in the country is 60%. In less than 10 kilometers of the from the mill. This in Aceh, and if you look at the map here, so we also have we also simulate in Riau. Let's see what is.
Mr. Manurung, sorry for interrupting. If we could just have maybe like a few more minutes, and then we can.
Okay. Yeah.
No, thank
so
you.
In Riau, we see that it is it is mill establishment that are driving deforestation. So once you develop mills and then creates more deforestation exponentially, not the other way around. So this is and then this is the trend that we are we can say that we can see here the volume, the production of our plantation basically year by year increase, while at the same time deforestation by palm oil is decreasing. So I think it clearly say that we can develop economic by without deforestation, and this is why we need to have a kind of a balancing production yield and the need of the mills, not only in national aggregate but also regional base, whether island base or provincial base. I think in Indonesia, I think island based, and if we can have, okay, for example, the capacity of the mill is balanced with the production of the production yield of the plantation, I think it is the answer for the country, not only in palm oil but also in timber plantation, but also in smelter, in mining, because we see this is the driver of deforestation. I think I will stop there. I give it back to you. Thanks.
No, thank you for sharing your experience, your expertise, and these amazing slides and graphics with us. I think among other things, it has been very interesting for me to map both geographically but also at the stakeholder level to whom and where with this proposed regulations, this like where and who would be most impacted by them. I will now introduce you to our last speaker, Professor Nyoman Pujawan. He's a professor of supply chain engineering at ITS. Professor Nyoman, with his colleagues, worked together on a special issue on sustainable supply chains and circular economy. As the Dean of the School of Interdisciplinary Management and Technology, ITS, he has proven himself as a productive researcher with citations numbering more than 400 annually between 2018 and 2022. Moreover, Professor Pujawan is also a practitioner who is active in a professional organization of the Indonesian Supply Chain and Logistics Institute, ISLI, where he has served as president. Professor Nyoman, thank you so much for joining us, and you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Paula. And thank you also for inviting me to share some of the ideas that I have related to the topic that we are discussing today. But actually, I'm not very much an expert in the area of deforestation, so I'm trying to share my views related to the implication of the new regulations that is currently, I think, on progress toward the implementation in the European Union, and how it will affect the exporting business from Indonesia. So it will be a brief presentation from myself, but I think it was quite clear from the earlier presentation that the proposal that we are discussing today is about preventing deforestation in the sourcing country like Indonesia, where the aim is to guarantee that the European Union citizen buy, use, and consume products that do not contribute to global deforestation and forest degradation. That is the first one. And the second objective is to reduce carbon emission to the atmosphere due to consumption and production. And finally, is to address any deforestation driven by agricultural expansion to produce the commodities that will be traded among the countries where they are produced and the country that will consume the product. Right, the form of the restriction, I think it was also mentioned by the earlier presenter, is to implement what is called due diligence requirement for corporation that involve in the supply chain of the product. And by supply chain means that any party that involves in the business, could be the plantation itself, the millings or manufacturing stage, the trading, and could also involve the sporting players in between, like transportation players. There are a number of commodities that will be directly affected. And unfortunately, many of these are actually produced quite well in a major quantity in Indonesia, like timber, coffee, cocoa, palm oil that we just heard from the earlier presenter. And from the business point of view, I think this could have a major impact on the exporting business from Indonesia to Europe if this is implemented. I would imagine that it could bring major impact because I believe that not every company will be ready, and it will take some time to make them aware and ready with the new regulation. And obviously, with the new regulation, I think it will require additional time and cost to comply with it, and will slow down the exporting process. And many small players will have difficulty in complying with the requirements, even though from the earlier presentation, it was quite clear that in most of the commodities that we are talking about, they actually dominated by large players. But I think there are also many small players that will have problems in adopting the regulation if it is implemented suddenly without sufficient time for creating awareness and preparation for all of those players. There are a couple of issues that I think need to be tackled before it is implemented. One is, I believe there is still something in gray area when we are talking about deforestation. So what is the operational definition of deforestation? So how would we measure that one business has a major deforestation and the other one is not, for example? Because let's say that the palm oil plantation that we have in Indonesia right now, it probably has contributed to deforestation long time ago, but probably not now if we are measuring it right now. So this needs to be very clear to the players, to the business. So what is the exact definition of deforestation? because in my opinion, many of them are quite unclear whether we are actually violating the regulation or we comply with the regulation. So that need to be very clear. I think I have heard also from some of the news, I read some of the news as well about this issue, especially from the perspective of Indonesian business people, that the regulation may somehow have what is called they are not really treating equally for all products produced in different countries. So maybe the impact would be higher for example, Indonesian business people rather than from European side, for example, if the product are actually produced in many different countries. So how to make sure that everybody in this business actually could see that the implementation of the regulation is fair for everybody. So that could be the second issue. The third one is about who will do the assessment. I remember a long time ago when businesses in Indonesia are required to comply with ISO 9000 certification, for example. And everybody was afraid because if you are not ISO certified, you will not be able to export your product to Europe. And supply chain is actually a very effective means of imposing any regulation like this, because if you said that I will not buy your product unless you comply with the regulation, then everybody will try to comply with that. But what is the cost behind that compliance? So like, for example, every business now required to comply with, let's say, ISO 9000, but the instrument is already well established. So I think the cost is not really high to achieve that or to comply with that requirement. But with this one, where you are required to be free from deforestation, how would you assess it? And to make sure that people will say, okay, I accept that one because my company is not actually implementing any of the requirements. Or maybe people are not really sure whether or not we already comply with that or not. So the assessment procedure and who will certify and who will assess will need to be very clear, and to avoid any problem with the implementation. So that's I think the second issue. The last one is still not quite clear how the process will be conducted. So from all of this issue, I think I'm trying to, even though I'm not a business people, I'm trying to stand as someone who will need to go through the process. But I think if I'm now doing, let's say, business related to coffee, cocoa, and palm oil, etc., the real business people, I would think that they are still not very clear of what to do and how actually the process will be done. So I think there are a lot of things like awareness workshop, for example, trying to make people aware about this and trying to make people understand and finally agree with the process. I think those kind of things are very much required before it is can be effectively implemented. So I think that's basically what I'm trying to share. I'm not a researcher in the area of deforestation, but I'm looking at the issue from the perspective of how businesses will be impacted by the new regulation. So I think that's all, Paula, from me.
Thank you so much, Professor Pujawan. This was really, really interesting. I think you raised topics that maybe are not always brought up in these debates, and that remind us that it's not just creating a regulation, but also to figure out a lot of other things, as you said, certifications, starting with definitions. So thank you so much for bringing this up. Considering the time, I would want to ask our panelists just one question, and then we only have a few Q&As from the participants, from the attendees, I'm sorry. So I think we can leave maybe like 5 minutes at the end to do that. But for now, I would like to ask all of you very short, simple question that can help, as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, to fulfill this informational gap. And the question is like, how can we improve the cooperation between Europe and Indonesia on supply chain matters? It's a bit broad, so feel free to adapt it to your industry or to your more for like corporate side or research side, whatever you think could help this cooperation and to avoid this informational gap in the future. Considering also the context that Luis gave us on the timelines that these proposed regulations have. How can we improve this cooperation? Anyone who wants to start?
Paula, could you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. So how can we improve the cooperation between Europe and Indonesia on supply chain matters?
Can I start with myself?
Yes, please, Professor. Thank you.
I think in the supply chain, we have what is called supplier development. That is very important, actually. So if you see that Indonesia, for example, is supplying Indonesian market, and market would like to have something different, then normally you need to develop the suppliers first before you require them to be comply with a new thing. So probably it will take some time to make sure that Indonesian suppliers are able to be aware and understand the requirements. So I think it does require a higher level of cooperation as a preparation to the new regulation.
Thank you, Professor.
Can I then follow that?
Yes. Yes.
I think the first thing you need to build the kind of understanding between the two. The two mean not only Indonesia and Europe, but also commodities as well. If you talk about palm oil, it's different supply chain with coffee. It's different with cacao, because in palm oil we have big corporate. In coffee you will not have that. In rubber, you have in rubber is not in the commodities yet at the moment, but possibly in coming years. But in cacao, in cocoa, it's in between. So then having getting understanding and knowledge of this commodity is the first start. And the second one for palm oil is, as we discussed, I think it's clouding by palm oil at the moment, the discussion. I think we also need to know as providing a safeguard. So the safeguard means for us, it's smallholders. As I mentioned, as we assist the government to have to mapping palm oil, and then we analyze further, and we only believe independent smallholders of palm oil Indonesia is about 2 million hectares. Although the government data is saying 6 million hectares, but perhaps it's corporate control, not independent smallholders. So having this map firstly, it's I think, or providing safeguard for the small players, I think it's the first one. So then you have support from the commons, not only for certain big corporation, etc. So this is the basic foundation that I think we need to cement first before we go further in the supply chain. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Manurung. Luis?
I think I totally agree with what has been said so far, and I just want to emphasize again certain elements. So I do totally agree with the fact that commodities will impact smallholders and the through supply chain differently, and yeah, specific guidance needs to be made for different commodities. And I very much would like to emphasize the proposal made by the Parliament in having the Commission design those commodity-specific guidelines on how to comply, for example, with the regulation, the deforestation regulation. This will help actors throughout the supply chain in understanding how exactly the regulations plays a role in their particular commodities that they're trading and how they will have to comply with the regulation. And I think there's also very much this thing of cooperation and the need for discussion between the different countries, raising awareness, as Professor Pujawan had said. This whole cooperation and partnership idea between in these interjurisdictional partnerships and cooperation mechanisms will play a very high role here. And I think the European policies have a lot of their role to play as well in making sure that we safeguard the right of smallholders and that we take them into account, and that we have proper impact assessment for how they will be touched by those regulations, and that we take care of those. Because of course, we, as was highlighted in different presentations, we want a fair distribution of the burden across the supply chain, and understanding that smallholders, yes, will be highly impacted by them.
Thank you so much, Luis. Professor Purnomo? You are muted. Sorry. We still can't hear you unless it's me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now, perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, for example, for oil palm, there is now about 3.2 million hectares of oil palm in Indonesia inside the forest area, which is illegal. So 3.2 million hectares. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pak Timur Manurung. It is illegal, and mostly who are there actually smallholders. Smallholders, many of smallholders located in the forest area, which is illegal. According to our own law, Indonesian law, so they cannot be certified. So in order to make them not out of the supply chain, it is the huge task of government to make sure whether legality of the smallholder, whether it is still illegal just right now, or under the agrarian reform to legalize the illegality. There's also huge task for government. Before talking about EU deforestation regulation, actually a lot of things that should be done by government, as well as 2.5 million hectares of oil palm actually on the peatland, and also illegal for oil palm having on the peatland with 2 meter depth. So also it is this is not a smallholder, but also the private sector large company. But then, of course, the private company able to move it because they have money. But the question where to move for oil palm on the peatland. Also have more or less the same case for coffee. Actually, most coffee area in Indonesia inside the forest area, actually, it is also illegal according to our own law. So this is also who should do that is government. Government is the locomotive for, because it is related to the land legality, property right. This is not clear until now. Just to add, just to make sure that smallholder also could benefit from the EU deforestation regulation is also the legality. If it is illegal, it's quite difficult to say they are deforestation free because they are inside the forest area. Thank you, Paula. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Is there anyone else would want to add something? I think now would be the time. If not, I think we could maybe jump to a few of the questions that were written in the Q&A box. Well, first, everyone, thank you for this answer. We're taking notes, and it also helps us shape a little bit where we want to focus our work in the next months, years. So this is really, really insightful for us. And as Elizabeth also said in her introduction, there has been dialogues that as Climate and Company, we had been trying to establish more with the Brazilian side, and from the Indonesian side, this is something we're still exploring, and this is of great help. We have one question. I think this could be directed to Luis, but also to anyone else that would like to answer. What does the CSDDD mean for small/Indonesian businesses that are business partners of companies exporting to the EU? So yeah, first you can retranslate as the CSDDD.
Yes,
but, yeah,
indeed.
Thank you.
So as I explained earlier, you have the value chain, which will not only focus on the companies within the scope, but throughout the value chain, all those different actors will be impacted. So if as a smallholder, you have a business relationship with one of those companies that have to comply with the due diligence directive in the EU, you will have certain obligations. And it's mainly information providing. You will have to provide the information that due diligence has been put in place, or that certain you will have to provide information on certain environmental risk, potential or actual impact, also on human rights provisions. So you will have to provide all that information to your supplier, to your client, basically, to your buyer. And this will make a lot of administrative work for those smallholders. For sure, they will have increased requirements from their buyers, which have to be considered, and thus the need as well for all those safeguards for those smallholders, which will be faced by those extra requirements. And it's also noteworthy to say that within the due diligence directive, normally there is in the current Commission proposal, there is the obligation to stop a business relationship with those of your supply chain who are not able to minimize or put an end to the risk that have been highlighted. So this will have a lot of effects on all those smallholders, for sure. And these have to be considered. So there are now talks on how to make that work exactly. And yes, and also just to restate this concept of established business relationship, which will have an impact as well on smallholders who could only face certain short-term contract, which cause a lot of risk, of course, financial stability risk, social risk, etc. So I think those are all elements which come in together and could impact smallholders and Indonesian producers, etc., which have to be considered.
Thank you, Luis. Mr. Manurung?
Yeah, I actually not answer that because I'm not. I just possible if may one thing that need to.
We cannot hear you. Sorry, if you could just repeat the question.
Yeah. More another view. UDR. Hello?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We can still hear you not super well. Maybe if you could type the question in the chat, or we can try also in a minute or so.
Okay. If hello?
Yeah, well, now it works. We can try one more time.
Okay. One point actually. At the end of the day, this will be about subsidy. This will.
Sorry, we lost you again there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it will be about subsidies. I
Mm.
think that's the last part that we heard.
What is about smallholders? Almost 90% of our small in Papua. We do not have smallholders, less smallholder in Kalimantan, for example. So then, at the end of the day, it will subsidize Sumatrans. What then the kind of let's say so then by this commodity, is it possible to provide that incentive for people protecting their forest, the remaining forest, through this UDDR mechanism? That's one thing I think we need to find in my idea, in my mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Manurung. I think the connection was not great, but I think that at the end it was, as you said, it was about subsidies, right? And how to create incentives for those smallholders that are still protecting forests to continue to doing so. Is that more or less the idea? Through the CSDDD.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there's no an answer to that yet, right? It's like something that has to be included in the conversations on how to implement these regulations at the end. But thank you so much for bringing this up. I would like to just address one more question that was written as well in the Q&A, which is what needs to be done and by whom in order to not pushing smallholders out of the supply chain. I know this has also been raised up in this last conversation that we've had, and also throughout the slides. But Professor Purnomo, you replied directly to the question on the chat. But if you could also share this with the other attendees, I think that would be really insightful for others as well. Thank you.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think for smallholder, for oil palm or for coffee, first related to the land legality, because as I say, they mostly, not mostly, but as I remember, 3.2 million hectare of oil palm inside the forest area and 80% of coffee inside the forest area, and some portion, a big portion of it is managed by smallholder. So it is the homework of government, the local central government, helped by civil society organizations, something like Auriga, and also academician, and also the private sector. This is a huge task, because if difficult to enter the EU, then the smallholders will be rejected. They're going to the mills, because you don't export the fresh fruit buns actually, but export the CPO. We export actually is not the smallholder, but the on the several like musim mas, like the Golden Agri Resources, are big companies. But if they source from illegal oil palm, then difficult for them to enter, and the result they will exclude the smallholder to sell to their mills. So it is the huge task of government, and I know that under Jokowi president we have a lot of program actually how to clarify the legality of the smallholder, but still the problem there is still not yet solved, because sometimes when we talk about smallholder, they are not homogeneous. Not all smallholders poor people. No, some actually very rich people, richer than me, richer than perhaps Pak Timur Manurung. The smallholder, what we call smallholder is not indigenous, as not native population, and some actually as a migrant, and some actually local elites categorized of smallholders. So we need to be aware. For instance, from the I talked with the Minister of Environment and Forestry how to legalize the smallholders, and I realized who categorize smallholder. If they are rich people and they cukong, and we give land to them, it means that is not fair. Because those who are already on the ground, who has capital, who has knowledge, is not indigenous people, but more migrant, more worker elite, cukong on the ground who own oil palm. Our research in Rio, the native, the indigenous people usually own only 1 or 2 hectares outside the forest area. But inside the forest area is not the indigenous people, but more migrant who own 20 hectares and 25 hectares of oil palm. This is, so be careful with term of smallholders. Not all smallholders you imagine from Europe as poor indigenous people is not. You come to Indonesia, look at the smallholders. Some actually very rich guy from Jakarta, from a big city who own land everywhere. Okay, thank you, Paula. Back to you.
No, thank you, Professor. I think this is a really big remark, and of course, only poses more challenges to how this specific implementation guidelines will be developed. But this is something that it has to be taken into consideration, and this is exactly the dialogues that we need in order to bring these questions out, right? Maybe from an EU perspective, we could this could be like generalized, or the term smallholders would be defined in a way that is not representative for the reality of Indonesia and other exporting countries. So this is great to be brought up, and thank you. I think I would like to now close the session, first thanking our organizational partners for making this as smooth as possible, to our amazing panelists for joining us today, for being very responsive in all the organizational process. We will keep you on the loop for any type of report or written form document that comes out of this event, because I really think what you have brought up to the table and to this dialogue is really important already now, but it's going to become even more important with the time, and as the proposals start to take more form, eventually to be implemented. It is not it's by far not a simple topic that we are discussing, but I'm sure that this would be the first of the many dialogues that well, not sure that it's the first, but for maybe we are still a bit advanced in that sense, like already having these conversations, even if this proposal will only become official, let's say in a few years. But it's important that we keep having these dialogues, that we keep all the most of the, or as many stakeholders involved as we want, as we can, starting from, as we have today, academia, private sector, practitioners, civil society representatives, but then also we need to expand this dialogue as well with, as mentioned recently, with different stakeholders, with different smallholders, sorry. So we make sure that everyone's needs, comments is taken into consideration on how then this regulations are applied. I think yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you everyone again, and please stay on the loop on our websites, both from the Climate Change Center ITB and from Climate and Company, as well as German Watch, in order to keep following this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you.
And a good evening for everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Terima kasih. Terima kasih.